previous to that, I spent 12 years at AFBF and grew up on a farm in Missouri. I've been in DC now almost 20 years, which I know you're thinking I don't possibly look old enough to have been here that long, but I am. And I can confirm that berry consumption, at least I have a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. We spend at least 10% of our income on berries alone. And when I look at trade figures and a declining trade balance that Betty was showing, I also think back so I grew up in the Midwest I'm aging myself, but mid 80s, right? And thinking about the difference in how my kids eat versus what I ate when I was that age. And so it's not surprising sometimes to see that discrepancy between imports and exports growing, particularly for those horticultural crops. Our ability to ship chilled products has come a long way in a pretty short amount of time. But when we get into fertilizer, and I hope none of this comes off as an excuse because I don't mean it that way. But when we talk about macro fertilizers, right, we're talking about N, P, and K. Nitrogen, you can produce that pretty much anywhere. As long as you have a feedstock like natural gas, or we have actually some nitrogen fertilizer in the US made from coal, you can pretty much produce nitrogen fertilizers anywhere. When we get into P and K, however, it's a product you either have it or you don't. Either the dinosaurs died in the right place or they didn't. And so I think particularly and we're going to talk about trade, I'm sorry, more than you wanted to for the afternoon. That's just the name of the game, I guess, this afternoon. But trade ends up having such a huge component of the fertilizer trade because of those natural resource endowments. So I want to talk first about those dinosaur deaths and global S&D for about the next 5 years out to give you a little bit of picture of where we think globally we're going with fertilizer production. And then I want to talk about the U.S. at large, the U.S. economy at large, net farm income. I'm not going to spend much time there. You guys are much more expert on it than Betty or I. But also then to talk about fertilizer S&D considerations in the U.S. relative to some of those other areas. And then we're going to talk about policy. Because I think for us, the areas where we're most concerned about the fertilizer markets, it continues to be in this policy consideration area. Things that we're doing and then things that other people are doing, frankly. So we're going to start here because where supply and demand, where the rubber meets the road, is what prices you all actually pay for the product, right? So I took us all the way back to 2019. Does this thing work? Am I doing anything? Nope. All right. 2019, prior to sort of the COVID and all the supply chain disruptions that started occurring, because human nature is that you measure the highs against the lows. And we'll look back here in just a minute. 2019 in the fertilizer space was relatively low if you look at the last 20 years of history. But we're all going to measure those 22, 23 highs against 2019. So as we're looking here through January of 2025, looking at overall, we're about 10% on fertilizer prices above where we have been over the last sort of 10 years. The purple line is a fertilizer price index, so all three NPK combined. The green is a Corn Belt ammonia price. I know we're not in the Corn Belt, but they suck up so darn much of it that it tends to set the market price for nitrogen. DAP is your orange, and that is the southeast price because not only is most of our phosphate production in Florida, but the product that we import also comes in through Florida. So that southeast price is what we measure against there. And then potash is your gray line. And as you can see from this pretty easily, phosphates, no surprise because you're the ones buying it, has remained elevated relative to the other two. Potash has come down. We've had some pretty significant additional production globally. Nitrogen, with some fluctuation has come down and stayed relatively, has stayed there. So, but as we look at, again, as I said, a longer time horizon, USDA publishes a producer paid index on fertilizer. And this is, so the blue line, the 100, is what prices were being paid in 2011. Obviously, anything below there is a reduction from that 2011 basis. Anything above it is an increase. So when we're looking here at these super elevated nitrogen price in 2022, that was 90% above where we were in 2011. But I put this up here, not to, because you all know the pain of that, but also to point out that basically 2015 through 2019, the industry was trading at below 2011 prices, which long-term has an impact on the investment that is occurring in these industries. So as we think about NPK, nitrogen, it tends to take, it's about $3 to $5 billion to build a new ammonia facility, and about 3 to 5 years. Potash and phosphates, global average for the construction of a new mine is about 10 years. So, and that's globally. Here in the US, we've got the Michigan potash mine, which has been finally completed their round of funding and has permits. They're ready to start production. We'll bring on production in 2026, but that's the first sizable addition to the potash landscape in the US in decades. So I mentioned this because when I was Betty, because I used to do the trade portfolio at Farm Bureau, and we were listening to the people who preceded me at TFI, and we're looking at prices, and they're explaining to us how high fertilizer prices were and all the reasons for that. The natural inclination is just produce more. How challenging is this if prices are this high? Well, I think when you start backing through that investment cycle, how long it actually takes to get the permits in place and the funding, when we're looking at it, the price environment in the fertilizer industry that preceded that huge run up, there wasn't the incentive, there weren't those economic conditions that preceded it to have started the construction of additional facilities. So today we're in a space where globally there has more additional facilities being planned. And we'll get to the US. The US has had some investment in the ammonia space, particularly in the green ammonia space. But as Betty mentioned, with the 45 tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act, those are largely in question as to whether or not those will move forward. So we've had a couple of additional ammonia facilities come online recently. Everything else, if they haven't broke ground yet, they're not moving forward at this particular juncture. They're waiting for those tax credits to see if those incentives actually come through. So I say all this, and I think it's important, and we don't talk about this often, but in the fertilizer space, it's truly a situation where imports and exports matter a lot. 90% of global nutrient use is outside of the US. So while we're incredibly important, we're the second largest fertilizer consuming country in the world. There's a lot of other big guys out there. And I think it matters too to try to help to understand why, and some of the swings that we see is that in the US, corn dominates fertilizer usage. 50% of usage comes from corn. When you add in beans, wheat, and cotton, it gets you up to about 75% of total nutrient use comes from those four commodities. So as those markets go, as goes the fertilizer market. So super frustrating. You're trying to make money, commodity prices go up. Why do fertilizer prices always follow it? Yeah, that's super frustrating. It's because fertilizer production, or part of the reason, like nitrogen production is steady throughout the year. And most of our facilities are at about 95% capacity. So when we see, like we saw last year, the difference between the February WASD and prospective plantings, where we saw a 4 million acre drop off, the market's like, well, I guess we'll export some of this nitrogen because there's not going to be nearly as much demand for it in the US as we previously thought. Or this year, USDA is at 91, and some in the market are projecting 96 million acres. 5 million acre flux on corn has a huge impact on the total amount of fertilizer demand in the US. So we're producing 95%, and it's an equal production month over month. So when the market is giving the fertilizer industry signals, we're going to plant that much corn. The only place to get it is from an import market. So we're bringing in a whole bunch of nitrogen all at once. That tends to increase the overall price of fertilizer in the market. So yes, it certainly follows. I would posit that it's not necessarily a conspiracy theory just to gobble up any potential returns that you might have, but they certainly are linked because obviously we need a lot of fertilizer in order to produce the volumes that we're talking about today. That being said, the global use of fertilizer looks quite different. 20%, while it's still large, only about 20% of global nutrient use is attributable to corn. Wheat, 15%, rice, 15%. Rice is 1% of the US market. So how closely are you all following the global rice market? Yeah, me neither. But it makes a big difference, right? Or 10% of usage is related to vegetables. Let's see where we at, 2% in the US. So there's a whole bunch of additional bounce out there of product that's being consumed that has a significant impact on the prices for fertilizer that are paid both globally and in the US. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly just because I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time here. But these forecasts are from IFA, which is the International Fertilizer Association. They're a couple years behind, so their numbers are trued up through 2023. So anything beyond that is considered a forecast. But as we look here, and in general, the fertilizer industry tends to think that we look at about 2 to 3% increase in fertilizer demand year over year. But IFA, as we're looking out here, is starting to say, hey boys, I think we're below like 2% potentially on the out. So as we're thinking again of backing that through on the supply, trying to increase supply to meet that demand, the signal that's sending is pull back on those additional investments for additional capacity. As we look through, so that's overall. As we look across the three nutrients, obviously see that nitrogen is the dog there. And then, phosphates sort of in between, beating the average a little bit. And potash usage really far exceeding the overall average fertilizer increase in demand. So we look at the supply side. So you can read this as the far left is total capacity in 2023. The far right is planned capacity in 2028. And then you can look across there where the additional increases in capacity are expected. And it's quite different when you look across the three nutrients, right? So as I said, on nitrogen, that's the easiest to add. And as we sort of look at where the additional planned capacity is, you see North America show up. We drop off pretty hard. Oh wait, phosphates, we're not even on there. And on potash, North America's on there, but that's not us. That's our Canadian friends. So I think there's a couple of different things here. One is the lower commodity prices, which are leading to lower fertilizer prices, are certainly changing the landscape on whether it makes sense to invest in additional capacity. And then the second thing is everything's getting greener, right? Everything is becoming more sustainable, and that's impacting fertilizer as well, which while the end goal might be, I'm indifferent, but it might be good, it might be bad, it does lead to additional cost for building that facility. So the driver, the fertilizer prices being lower, is decreasing that incentive, as is additional cost for putting that facility together. Additional tariffs on on steel and aluminum, that we need a lot of that in order to build a nitrogen facility, certainly don't help this. So as we sort of add that up across time, when we look at total fertilizer demand, it looks like S&D are largely in balance, right? In fact, we should expect a little bit of relief that overall supply would outstrip demand growth by just a smidge. But when we look at across the three nutrients, things change pretty significantly. Nitrogen largely expected to stay in balance. Again, pretty easy to forecast, and also pretty easy to add supply when necessary. Phosphorus, I'm sorry, I think we're going to continue to see elevated phosphorus prices for a couple of different reasons, and we'll talk about that. But supply growth expected a little over 9%, demand growth expected 11.5%. So a pretty sizable gap between S&D there. And on potassium, we should expect to continue to see potash prices decline when those mines are on, when they have made that investment decision to add that additional capacity, they go. So it's expected that total supply will be almost 19% growth and demand growth 15%. So some good news, some neutral news, some bad news. Probably depends on what you grow. So before we get into ag, I think it's important, and Betty talked about the market facilitation payments, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those here and at the end of the presentation. But it's important, I think, to put the ag economy in context of the larger economy, because it matters a lot, particularly in DC, when they're thinking about what industries might potentially need some additional assistance. So Betty and I are wrong a lot. Betty's dad, I don't know if you guys know this, is a meteorologist. And that means in that family, they have the two professions that get it wrong the most. Meteorologists and economists. So congratulations on that.
Still keep their job.
Yeah, right, I guess. So back in 2023, everyone, with all the Wall Street economists, the Federal Reserve, they were predicting that we were going to go into recession in 2024. And my goodness, it turned out quite differently, right? Unemployment remains historically low. We're a little over 4%. The econ profession sort of considers full employment to be a 4% unemployment rate. You've got to have a little bit of give there. And that's about where we're at today. We're at 4.1. More actual humans are working. So the total number of bodies out who are actually committing work is higher today than we were pre-recession or pre-COVID. Productivity growth is good. Now this typically doesn't happen when you have a really high, a really low unemployment rate. You tend to see productivity growth fall off because people are more confident that no one's going to replace them. But that hasn't been the case. We've continued to have good productivity. Household spending at 3.8% is certainly below where we were in 2019, but the long-term average is about 5.5. So okay-ish. GDP growth in 2024 was 2.8%. 2023 it was 2.9%. This big, beautiful, giant economy that we have, we typically are hoping for 2%. So at large, the U.S. economy is doing relatively well. It may not feel like that from an individual standpoint because everyone has their own situation, but at large, the ball is growing at a pretty decent speed. Now, compare that to farm income, and these numbers are a bit out of date because of last week's update, but since 2022, the most important takeaway, and you all know this, is that net farm income dropped by almost a quarter in 2 years. Now it depends a lot on are you a grain producer, are you a livestock producer? There's quite a lot of difference in people's projection because of that, but overall, it has been a rough couple of years. Groundbreaking news, right? But when we put the U.S. farm income relative to the U.S. economy, I think it then becomes a much more interesting dynamic when we're talking about potentially additional assistance from the federal government. So if there's, and not to be too basic about this, but if there's a long line of industries who are seeing such a negative situation like we are in U.S. agriculture, it becomes more difficult to release those funds. If it's a relatively short list of industries that are in the financial situation that agriculture is in, it becomes easier. When we look at planted acres, man, the thing that my industry worries about a lot is right here, is when we're looking at about a 312 million planted acres, which is what we had last year, which is what we thought we were going to get this year, or for 25, and we look at overall fertilizer demand, which is this dotted line here, and we compare that, the bars are planted acres, the black dotted is overall fertilizer, nitrogen is red, P is green, and K is orange. There's been a lot of discussion is as we're coming out of this and continued slightly elevated fertilizer prices at large and a low net farm income, low commodity prices, are we expecting overall fertilizer use to look more like this? Like that 2014 through 2019 era where we had low commodity prices, but people put fertilizer on at pretty high level, at agronomically appropriate levels, because that's one of the things that they can control? Or is there concern here? And for us, we're expecting to continue for it to look a little bit more like this 14 through 19 era, that we're going to continue to have pretty agronomically appropriate and relatively high fertilizer application, because that's what we can do to drive production. And I think it's important here that was an overall, the U.S. economy at large was in recession. So that previous, a couple of slides ago, we're talking about the fact that the whole U.S. economy is doing relatively well is relevant here as well. That people are still, we're still going out to eat, we're still selling things, we're still buying things. The overall total demand for goods is still high, and therefore we wouldn't expect to see this sort of a dip in fertilizer consumption. It's a big deal for you all because we may have all forgotten about 2008. The retailers who carry fertilizer have not forgotten. There was a lot of guys who got caught with some really expensive product in 2008. And in large part, that's why over the last couple of years, you'd call when we were in the price environment 22, 23, and you'd call to get a price on fertilizer. They say, I won't quote you a price. It's because there are a lot of guys who almost went out of business here. And they much more want to price in real time than to try to promise a price way far out when they see so much volatility. Now, that makes it a lot harder for you all to put your budgets together. Certainly understand that. But I will share that from a retailer's perspective, those guys are buying fertilizer just like anybody else. They're not, unless you're Nutrient, you're not producing it yourself, or Simplot. So they're in the market, of that market fluctuating, and they don't want to get caught with that volatility either. So, I think I might skip this one. There's a lot smarter people in this room on planted acres in large part, but I'll just say that this is from FAPRI, which is the Food and Ag Policy Research Institute out of the greatest land grant in America, University of Missouri. Yes, that's where I went to school. There's a lot of great land grants, but anywho, up until this was last fall, they haven't put out their recent estimate yet, but they were basically predicting a 312 million acre output through 2029, with a small change over time of about 500,000 acre decline in corn every year. So to the previous point, or 2 presentations ago, there's a lot of volatility. There's always going to be a lot of volatility. 6 months ago, this is the signal that the market was sending, that we're going to continue to lose corn acres for the next 5 to 7 years. And again, because I worry a lot about fertilizer markets, this is the up until 6 months ago, this is the signal the market was sending the fertilizer industry. Because again, back through 50% of our nutrient use here in the United States is related to corn. So the prospect of declining corn acreage for the next 5 to 7 year out period was pretty negative. So let's get to the fun stuff. And there's a lot of bad news. So policy considerations, there's kind of 3 buckets. 1, there's global policy considerations. And then 2, we've got US policy considerations. And then we've got this fun sort of volleyball domino, pick your analogy, but those policy considerations feeding upon one another. So on sort of thinking globally, we've got geopolitics still at play. And so we'll get to this in more detail in a minute, but I'll just pick on potash because it's at the top of everybody's minds. There's only about 3 countries in the world that export sizable amounts of potash. You have to choose from Canada, Russia, Belarus. That's it for sizable volumes. So when we think about Russia, Belarus, Canada, well, Canada isn't so much there isn't the chance of necessarily war along that lines, but Russia's involved. Belarus has sanctions against it for crimes against their own population. There's continues to be a lot of turbulence and the potential, and particularly in the last couple of years, it's been upward price pressure. But my industry is really getting interested in the potential for peace between Russia and Ukraine. My goodness, what that would do, because Russia is a major player in all 3 macronutrients. So before we were managing just for the risk of increased prices, today there's starting to be a lot of concern or thoughts, maybe concern isn't the right word, but thoughts about, my goodness, if the Russians and the Ukrainians find a peace agreement, that's going to have some pretty sizable downside risk for fertilizer prices as well. So that remains. We have potential for political change in key markets. That's that sort of unknown that has the potential to be pretty significant. Export controls, particularly in China. Betty mentioned this a minute ago, that the Chinese are already thinking about retaliating against US tariffs with export controls. This was probably, frankly, a bigger deal 5 years ago with fertilizer. We don't purchase a lot of fertilizer from China anymore. Not because we wouldn't take it, but because they're not willing to sell it. So particularly in the phosphates market, back in about 2022, China started sucking up a huge amount of phosphate rock for EV battery production. They outpaced the rest of the world by orders of magnitude on the production of those batteries, to the point where prior to 2022, China was exporting phosphate materials. Today, they're really not exporting any longer, and in fact are importing a lot of phosphate rock. Their domestic phosphate rock is being used for fertilizer production internal to China, but they're also importing a ton of high quality phosphate rock for that EV battery market. So when we talked about there being a 2% gap between S&D expectations and phosphates over the next 5 years, that's in large part because we're seeing a significant growth in industrial use of phosphates, particularly in the Chinese market. Regulations on consumption, y'all are in the Bay, you know all about this, but we're starting to see challenges pop up in other states. And this is typically something that we worry about when we switch political parties in power in Washington, where the expectation for regulation on environmental issues is no longer federally mandated. the states have a tendency to come in and take up that space. So we're looking at potential controls on fertilizer application, and we've seen legislation in Oregon, we've seen legislation in Minnesota, we've seen legislation in Maine. So this is something that we're certainly keeping an eye on, and it comes in all different form and fashion as far as is it a tax on that application? Is it an outright ban of application over a certain tonnage? That's to be seen, but it's certainly something that we're keeping an eye on. U.S. policy from a U.S. government action consideration. The IRA clawbacks, I've mentioned that already, but there's 45 tax credits have a pretty significant impact on investment decisions as it relates to green ammonia. And so a lot of those investment decisions are on hold as folks are trying to see. We know that the Trump administration is not a fan of the Inflation Reduction Act, but could those tax incentives be rebranded? TBD, but that has a pretty significant, could potentially have a significant impact. Farm Bill, obviously, I'm not going to talk much with a grower group about the Farm Bill, but it's a big deal. I don't know if you've heard. And the fact that we keep punting this down the road is significant. Now they're talking about no real discussions on Farm Bill occurring until this fall. So yet another entire growing season with the safety net, as it were, in its current condition. EPA regs on facility development and fertilizer product use. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but EPA continues to have a significant impact on where facilities can be built and what products might be able to be utilized. The Clean Air Act is actually kind of a bigger deal for us than the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act is important. We are point source facilities, but the Clean Air Act ends up being a larger constraint today on the ability to locate a site that has enough, what's the word I'm looking for here? Potential in order to build a new facility. Working on it. But the tariffs is certainly the biggest deal today. It was mentioned before, exchange rates and interest rates. Those obviously have the monetary policy that the U.S. Engages in, and our activities there have a domino effect on interest rates here in the U.S. and thus exchange rates. A prolonged low price crop environment obviously is challenging for the growers themselves, but everyone who's an input industry. And then a tariff war, so any other countries' reactions to our tariffs. So I want to dig into, point this out pretty quickly, but we produce a lot of fertilizer in the U.S. We also import a lot of fertilizer in the U.S. Both are critical. And we can't really we can't not have either. So coming from a grower perspective, my first 20 years of my career, we were thinking mostly about exports and the fact that, well, if it's an import, that means it's displacing the potential production and expansion of industry in the United States. It's not really the case in our industry. Because of those deposits occurring in pretty random locations for mineral exploration. When we look at I'm going to sit here for just a second. Current fertilizer production in the U.S. I took this back to 2018. This is on a fertilizer year basis, which starts in July. So the U.S., the phosphate and the nitrogen numbers are exclusive to the U.S. The potash number is a North American total because, U.S. production wouldn't show up. So we have to include Canada in order for that to be a relevant statistic. But as you look there, this is production through September of 2024. Overall, no real concerns as far as production is concerned. I would highlight this, the red line on phosphates. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But as you can see, long-term trend is lower production of phosphates in the U.S., but that is not a recent phenomenon. That is something that's happened over the last decade or so. So I want to dig into across input. Yes, sir.
Is Canada going to put a tariff on the potash?
Yeah. 100%.
25%?
Yeah. I don't know. I say that with a lot of, a glib confidence. We don't know. Yes, probably. Will it be 25%? Up until a few days ago, there was no discussion of anything below 25%. Over the last couple of days, it's like, well, energy is going to get 10. Maybe there's some possibility for flexibility. Yes, there'll be something.
Because potash is most highest mineral. Now it's going to be 25% more.
Yeah, I'm come back to nitrogen. I'm glad you brought it up. We import 98% of our consumption of potash. 87% of that comes from Canada. Another 10% comes from Russia. Then there's a few little small players, but we don't have it.
I know.
We're just, I'm glad you know. Please tell all of your elected officials.
Well, they all know.
I don't know. You know, we had a meeting, and please don't quote me on this, but some time ago, a couple of weeks ago, we had a meeting with some new folks at the White House, and about halfway through, one of them said to me, "So is potash just used on stuff like avocados?"
Well,
Just liberal food.
a lady told me one time, I don't need you farmers, I could go to my Acme, so.
Yeah, exactly. So they know, but they don't know. And I know it's a constant battle to try to educate without making people feel stupid, right? How do you kindly educate people?
Yeah, you get chocolate milk from brown cows and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah. So this is an aside, and I'll get back to the real material. But I have a 4-year-old, and I had to break the news to him the other day that chicken is the same as chicken meat. And every day we have the conversation, what do dinosaurs eat? Oh, well, like specific dinosaurs. Well, they eat meat. Like what? Other dinosaurs, buddy. Like they're like the reality. I have these city kids, and I'm trying not to have them be too city, but it's a constant battle. It's very much like talking with legislators sometimes. But so this is important, right? This is like, and the other element here is that we're trying to have a conversation about is that it's not just whether or not you put the tariff on, it's the threat of it. What have markets been doing the last 4 or 5 weeks under the threat of potential tariffs? Well, if you're trying to buy potash, you've seen it, and there are real consequences to even having these discussions. Does that mean they shouldn't be had? No, but it's not a yes or no. There's an impact or there's not an impact depending on whether or not the product actually or the tariff gets applied. So let me go back to nitrogen, because while we've been doing a good job messaging on potash, I think some of the story on nitrogen gets a little lost. We produce about 88% of our ammonia needs domestically. We import 12%, and about half of that comes from Canada. So if we were to have a situation where we're having 25% tariffs on nitrogen, that would have some impact on the U.S. nitrogen price story, but it's going to have a lot more for anybody who's sourcing Canadian product. So the upper Midwest, do you all get any Canadian product? You're probably not northern enough. Yeah, I mean, who's going to transport ammonia very far? But so regionally, these impacts will be more significant for nitrogen than on potash. We're talking that it will be national in scope. Urea, which tends to be the when we have these big bumps and potential planted acres, and we need to source some nitrogen in a hurry, it's urea. and about a third of that urea that used in the United States is imported. Over a quarter of that is coming from Russia, another 21% from Qatar, 11% from Saudi, all traditionally very stable places that we are very comfortable with being dependent upon, right? Not for me, I'm not always super comfortable with that. There's a lot of potential geopolitical risk in those places. Ammonium sulfate, about 30% of our consumption of ammonium sulfate comes from Canada. Comes from imports, and over 40% of that is Canadian. Ammonium nitrate, we don't import a lot, but the vast majority of what we do import is Canadian.
Yeah, but you need an act of Congress to get it, ammonium nitrate.
Yeah, that
I
one's.
want to build a bomb, but I want to put it in my field.
You know, I'm glad you bring this up because one of the things some of the feedback that we get is surely there's just reserves of fertilizer. There's, again, that Missouri upbringing comes back. Do you remember when we had the big caves of government cheese in Missouri? I think there's the thought that we do that with fertilizer too. And frankly, some of our product just isn't safe enough to store in any significant volume for any significant amount of time. So that's something that we've also been having conversations about, is there aren't just magical reserves of fertilizer products to tap into. And frankly, we probably don't want some of it in large volume. And then on phosphates, I said this one has changed significantly over the last 10 years. The US, 10 years ago, we produced about 80 to 90% of our phosphate needs. That's changed significantly. Today we import about a quarter of our MAP needs. I'm going the wrong direction. So confidence inducing, isn't it? A quarter of our MAP needs are imported, and about a third of that's from Saudi. DAP, we're up to 50% of consumption is imported, and 60% of that is from Saudi Arabia. TSP, 100%, if you use that product, 100% of TSP is imported, and over 50% of that is from Israel, also subject to its own geopolitical challenges at the moment. So I will just, in all of this, my primary point is that you see the same countries popping up, right? There's certain countries that are endowed with the resources of fertilizer or energy that you need to make nitrogen. And it's pretty concentrated, frankly. And so any potential geopolitical challenges in any of those markets have the ability to move the market pretty significantly. Betty mentioned, so I'm gonna, I think this is my last slide. Something that worries me a lot is the potential for folks to get too comfortable with the idea of an MFP type payment. So the market facilitation program is here in the gray. So started in 2018 through 2019 and finished in 2020. A good amount of money came out. It was predominantly because of destruction of Chinese demand. Our chart earlier showed that China is about 14% of US exports. Sizable, incredibly important, fairly concentrated in a handful of commodities. Devastating to the bean market. We sell a lot of pork to China, a good amount of pork products, but fairly easy. USDA would probably hurt me if they heard me say that, but fairly easy to estimate the impact, right? It was mainly a price side challenge. There was some multiplication on planted acres and the difference between the price at plant versus when the tariffs went into effect, and that's how they measured the impact. The 2018 MFP program was on I want to say pork and dairy on the livestock side, and some commodities, and maybe 6 specialty crops. 2019 expanded it to 20 some odd specialty crops, but it was still the commodities, and pork and dairy. Betty showed us earlier that Canada is a third of US ag exports. We don't have enough money for that. The CCC is helpful, but they can't move enough money to compensate for the damage that tariffs back and forth. Yes, we import a lot of fertilizer. It's important, but when we think about the interconnectivity of the livestock markets, the example of the potatoes, how do you start to compensate when such a significant portion of the U.S. ag industry would be impacted by substantial tariffs between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S.? That keeps me up at night because, yes, the rural America is incredibly important to this administration, and they've said they will take care of farmers. I think there's going to be a longer delay between impact and any potential payment than last time. And the consequences would be significant during that time frame. So there's just some other positive things for you to rule on. Certainly, as we think about over the last 10 years or so, obviously the big bumps that we've seen in aid did not come, as you all know, they did not come from our traditional Farm Bill programs. Not really. They came from the Market Facilitation Program, and then this green polka dot is supplemental and ad hoc disaster assistance. So that was COVID money, that was a disaster, like natural disaster aid. So USDA's, their forecast for this year is that government payments are going to be like $42 billion, which is up from $9 billion in 24. That worries me a little. That worries me that the amount of money that would need necessary to offset the damage between a disruption with so much of U.S. ag trade, that the delay would be so potentially long that there's going to be a good number of people who get caught in the interim. So that's my good news. But sort of at large, I'll say fertilizer production in the U.S. pretty steady. No, I have no concerns there. The real concern is policy related and our ability to source pretty critical imports. And then long term, globally, there are a lot of investments occurring that funds have already committed, project development is already underway in order to continue to add steady supply of products across NP&K. Countries have realized there's a lot of power in controlling resources. And so when you are Russia, or we'll just stay there because I think we can all agree they're bad guys, and the Chinese as well, they've realized that there's a lot of challenges, that they can cause a lot of problems for other countries when they are able to control those resources. So I don't know that it's necessarily something in the water, or just they also know a lot more about the world than we did 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Everybody has access, for the most part, to excellent information. And those USGS reports that I get, the folks in the Russian government can also get. That to point, these are our estimates for global reserves of potash. These are our estimates of global reserves of phosphates. They also have talented intellectuals as well that are able to say, I think we can exert some additional influence by controlling these pretty critical resources. Yeah.
For the mined products like phosphates and potash, is that just, like you said, it's like where the dinosaurs died? Like, if we really wanted to, like, do we even have the resources to mine, and if we could get the mines built?
No. On potash, no. We could add additional, we could be less dependent on foreign sources, and that would be helpful. But can we, on potash, could we 100% offset our total needs? No. I shouldn't say it with so much confidence, because I have actually never been in a fertilizer mine, and it's on your bingo card for if you are in the fertilizer industry, like, have you been in a potash mine? Because they're way down there, like miles and miles below ground. But as the information I have available to me today, no. And also on phosphates, probably no. We used to supply most of our phosphate needs, so that one may be a bit closer to yes, but certainly not on potash. Yes, sir.
Is there a time that, let's say, you're worried about nitrogen prices, should I be looking at natural gas at a certain time of the year and thinking, okay, this is what's going to happen? Is there a certain time of the year?
When it's cold, natural gas prices go up when it's cold. The Northeast is much more reliant on natural gas as a source of heat than other parts of the country. So I wouldn't do it once the home furnaces have kicked on. It's probably a little late. But about 70% of ammonia cost is attributable to natural gas. So hooray, and this is very much a good news story in the fertilizer industry. Let's see, 1985 or so, we had about 40 ammonia facilities in the US, and we saw that get down to about 15 prior to the natural gas revolution. Fracking has allowed us to reinvigorate the ammonia industry, and today we're supplying 90% of our ammonia needs. So certainly that is an industry that turned around dramatically as a result. Yes, sir.
What is the major reason for the domestic phosphate production decline?
So that one's kind of interesting. One is we've also seen a good number of phosphates, instead of being sold as MAP or DAP, being sold as an upgraded product. So Mosaic has a multi-mineral product that they've started pushing more phosphates into that. I'd also say that over time, the quality of reserves we're getting into lower quality rock, and so you're able to produce less MAP, because there's a prescribed amount of phosphate you have to have in those products, and when your rock quality goes down, then you're just not able to make as much in product as you once did. I'd also note, and because all things are linked, phosphate never goes away. Like the stacks, that what's left from production never goes away. In other parts of the world, they have utilized that for road material. So a lot of Brazilian roads use those stacks as building material. We used to be able to do that in the US, and that ability went away. During the first Trump administration, there was moves to be able to use that material once again. And one of the first things the Biden administration did when they came in was to strike that. Florida has a project, a state project that they just passed to allow you to use that product yet again, but in state projects. So yada yada yada. What I'm getting to is that what should be a co-product has been very much relegated to just a thing that you have to take care of, and that adds additional cost rather than it being a helpful means of disposal for that byproduct. So we're hopeful that will add additional productivity and revenue for the phosphate industry, where they'd be able to use that as a roadside material rather than just as a waste product. Thank you very much.